This is the Fixer Punk podcast with an important public service announcement to not debate your mother about politics this Mother's Day. I'm Grayson Peltier. I wanted to cover a few different stories that I think all overlap with each other. First off, the most urgent, severe, serious situation going on right now today in American politics, of course, is the debt ceiling. By some accounts, we're only about 18 days away from reaching the debt ceiling and hence only about 18 days away from a global economic collapse potentially. And there were some discussions that occurred on Tuesday between the Biden White House and Kevin McCarthy, other members of the Republican and Democratic Party leadership as well. They don't seem to have gone that far. There was another meeting that was scheduled for Friday. That meeting did not take place. It was instead replaced by a meeting between the staff of Kevin McCarthy's office and some White House officials as well, and a few other individuals as well. There's plenty of coverage on this. I'm going to link a Politico article in the description so you can take a look at that. But on that same very day that meeting was postponed, a lot of the rationale and the reasoning, I think, behind the stuff that's in the debt ceiling bill crumbled down. And that was because of a Fed economist and an economist from the University of Massachusetts who appeared on an NPR show called Planet Money, explaining that the whole wage price spiral theory of inflation that the Republicans have been pushing, and frankly big corporations have been pushing, is not really the case. So that is actually part of the impetus, or at least the reason why the Republicans would sell some of the policies in their deal as being good for the public generally. And that kind of came crashing down. And of course, it is what I've been saying and what other progressive and leftist commentators have been saying this whole time, which is that it is in fact profits that are spiraling inflation upwards, and more than half of inflation is due to profits. They're calling this a profit price spiral or a price spiral, that prices going up begets prices going up. And it's not because people are asking for higher wages. But back to the debt ceiling, a lot of the policies are aimed supposedly at basically trying to stop, as I've explained on a prior episode, trying to stop workers from seeking higher wages, even though they may not be effectual at pushing what they're claiming, which is more people to get into work, specifically the work requirements, but also any of these mechanisms that are being used to pull money out of the economy. Those things like budget cuts to the federal spending, those are all things that pull money out of the economy. And the logic of that fixing inflation would be because you're taking away demand, and demand is the cause of inflation. But we're coming to find out that no, we're talking about more than half of it is actually corporate profits and not demand and not wages. So that impetus is kind of taken away. But the politics, as you'll see, are way, way different from the economic facts and reality that have been substantiated by those economists and also by other great economists like top economists from European banking organizations that have changed their tune on the whole inflation issue. The political current status on this is that the White House wants a 2-year deal, according to Politico, and McCarthy and the Republicans want a 10-year deal on this. And also, according to Jake Sherman of Punchbowl News, which Punchbowl News is a really credible source of news amongst DC insiders, the Republicans really want to bring home one item from the limit, save, and grow categories, basically, which are the 3 categories of the Limit, Save, Grow Act, which is that proposal that Kevin McCarthy came up with. And some of the more likely things to go with that are going to be pulling back money from COVID relief bills that's unspent, as well as reforms to energy project permitting seems to be a big one that there may be bipartisan agreement on. And there may be an overall budget cutting mechanism that's sort of automatic. What I expected, and as somebody who's sort of in some ways a veteran of the last two times the debt ceiling has been politically weaponized and was part of the organization that sort of came up with the whole idea of politically weaponizing the debt ceiling, me being part of the Tea Party movement. I remember the sequestration deal, which Tea Party people actually weren't very happy with it. It was definitely a compromise. But I was definitely seeing something like a sequestration deal where the cuts aren't necessarily specified. It's not, but an overall mandate to cut, and however it's going to get cut, it'll get cut across the board if they can't all come to an agreement and figure it out after the fact. So that kind of interim temporary spending cut of just like, we're agreeing to a third or whatever spending cut, whatever percentage spending cut, but we're not going to say what percentage is going to come from where just yet. We'll figure that out. That's the kind of thing that I could honestly see this being resolved as, but there are some differences this time around. And one of the big differences, one of the things that Jake Sherman actually brought up was that this Republican Party isn't as economically, and specifically Kevin McCarthy isn't as much of an economic ideologue. He's an ideologue on other things, but he's not like a Paul Ryan who specifically runs on budget, and their conservative grassroots isn't really being mobilized. Sherman didn't bring this up, but I believe this is relevant, really, because the conservative grassroots, the Tea Party stood for taxed enough already. It was primarily on economic issues. The conservative grassroots now is mostly on cultural issues, on basically trying to go after different outgroups that they think are harming people in society. There's a populism going on, and a sort of a strange populism behind it. That's why every once in a while you have accidental overlap between Tucker Carlson and some sort of left-wing position, is because it is more of a populist party. So that kind of changes things a little bit. The dynamic is definitely going to be a bit different regardless of what the economic reality is, because what the economic reality here is that, of course, we can, and I'm not going to give a lecture on modern monetary theory, but this debt ceiling situation is an invented situation. It's a fiction. We could just get rid of it if we really wanted to. It's for stuff that the government has already paid for. But the reality of how the Republican Party would sell this is, of course, this government is spending less money. That means less money out of your pocket, and less government spending means less inflation. And that's not what's going on here. And the solution to that from one of the economists, and one of the things that could actually help are the government fiscal side of things, separate from the economic things, is also a solution to the non-wage price, not the wage price spiral, but the profit price spiral that we're having right now, which Isabella Weber, the economist from the University of Massachusetts, who is explaining that inflation is costs plus profits, and costs isn't really the issue, it's the profits part that's the issue. She proposed one possible solution she discussed that's been used in the past is price controls, but another one will be a windfall profits tax. And that would help with the fiscal situation. That would bring in revenue to the federal government, not take it from people who are average, normal working people. But it would bring in revenue to the federal government, and you bring in revenue, that reduces that offsets government spending, and that is deficit reducing. That's how the Inflation Reduction Act worked, is that it reduced the amount of the deficit by bringing in more revenue. Well, of course, the IRS agents, there are cuts to IRS agents in this Limit Save Grow Act, and that would in fact go against that. That action would be deficit increasing if you take that alone, and it would be potentially inflation increasing, and it wouldn't help with the debt because it wouldn't help with the deficit. But they're willing to say, we're going to get rid of the funding for the mythical 87,000 new IRS agents, which is mostly just replacing people who are going to retire and people doing all kinds of like random jobs like admin people, IT people, clerical people, stuff like that. But that is the irony of that part. But you could use that solution, of course. And the thing is, and then of course, when we're talking about the quote unquote growing the economy part of this Limit, Save, Grow Act, what they're proposing, one of the big parts of that is to supposedly grow the economy and fix the problems in the economy, is to impose work requirements on Medicaid. And of course, the cuts to government spending are going to create a lot of uncertainty, and they're going to cause people, when you have economic uncertainty and you don't know if your job is going to be secure, and overall hiring has gone down because the federal government is the number one purchaser of goods and services in the world, then of course you're going to be less likely to demand more money from your bosses. You're going to be less likely to go on strike, to seek higher wages. I'd hope workers would still see through it and still strike, still organize, still seek to unionize, still seek better. But we all know the reality is that you get anxious, you get scared, you don't really do those things as much. And that's the point of these policies, as I've explained before. But downward pressure on wages is not necessary anymore to solve inflation. Downward pressure on wages isn't going to even solve any sort of government fiscal issue either, because your wages are getting taxed more than the rich people's profits. Windfall profit tax would fix that. But this won't. And that's another irony of all of this. And other central banks are realizing that, yeah, the inflation isn't really being caused by isn't being caused by wages, it's being caused by profits. The UK central bank made the ridiculous statement of telling workers to stop asking their bosses for raises, which of course that didn't work. It couldn't have worked. Now they're asking companies to stop raising prices. That probably is equally ineffectual. And the our own Fed is the one that came out with that research saying that the majority of inflation is coming from increases in prices. And in fact, the Fed economist Andrew Glover, who appeared on that NPR show, explained that the majority of inflation after a recession, or there's a major contribution to inflation after any recession, from increases in corporate prices. And we had a recession in 2020 induced by the pandemic. So it is really, the Limit, Save, Grow Act is really a solution in search of a problem. But the solution that they're proposing is, number one, it's a cover-up, because the thing is that companies basically anticipated inflation, and the expectation basically created reality. And the fact that they kept saying inflation, 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 there's this crazy situation where all the prices are going up, that basically allowed companies to have cover for, oh yeah, we can just raise our prices and increase our profits while nobody else is looking, and just say, oh yeah, it's because there's a situation with oil, there's a situation with this cost or that cost or supply chain. And people wouldn't blame the companies for it because they believed that it was truly outside their control when they were just trying to grab money. So by imposing a fake solution, you make the fake problem seem more real. But then the other solution that this serves to put forward is the GOP. I said before that McCarthy is not as ideological economically. Jake Sherman of Punchbowl News reported on that. But the Republicans and McCarthy are ideologically about prejudice, and they have their primary priority of oppressing outgroups. And you can use economic tools to do that. Now, if we really had a supply chain issue, a labor shortage, you know what could really solve that? New immigrants. But instead, they're pushing an immigration bill that is going to further restrict immigration. Immigration is you bring in more supply of workers. That's how you fix a labor shortage. But this isn't about a labor shortage to them, as much as it is to push their own agenda of saying they're oppressing outgroups, which the whole welfare queen myth, we could go into that all day. That was to say that black people, and specifically black women, were lazy and costing the government money. Entirely racist concept that still proliferates in American politics in spite of being thoroughly and heavily debunked. Um, and that is what some of these tools may be about. Especially these work requirements. And I keep hammering down on the whole Medicaid work requirement thing. The SNAP work requirements are also bad. You're going after older people, senior citizens, who are in need of food assistance. But SNAP has had, and it does have work requirements attached to it. So it would be merely an expansion. The Medicaid work requirements would be entirely new. And those would be literally deadly to some people. People could die from those because they would not have access to adequate health care. We're talking about people with severe disabilities that don't know how to navigate the process, especially with mental illnesses. National Alliance on Mental Illness has come out against the Medicaid work requirements. A lot of the major health organizations like the American Lung Association, the American Cancer Society, Susan G. Komen for the Cure, they've all come out against the Medicaid work requirements because they're not about actually bringing people back to work. I have an inclination that behaviorally it'll put people in fear, but what it also does, put people in fear so that they don't ask their bosses for raises or seek to strike or seek to leave a bad employment situation. But matter of fact is they don't improve employment outcomes in the long term, especially not for those with any sort of health condition. That would restrict their ability to work. But what they do is they allow Republicans to say, look, we are taking action against those lazy idiots who don't want to work. We're making them go back to work, and that is how we are doing our job for you, the hardworking, tough American. And they're going to go to their districts and make that claim to people. And they could say, well, look at those weasel Democrats. They're not even willing to put work requirements. They're not willing to make people work for what they have. And it's that indignation that's their goal. Their goal isn't like the Paul Ryans of prior generations, where it was just like, economically, we have to make sure that we are stimulating the labor market and that we are reducing government debt, which will hence reduce taxes. By reducing government spending, we reduce taxes and we put money into your pockets because the government is taking money from your pocket. Now it's more about attacking an outgroup. And of course, poverty is a proxy for a lot of different outgroups, specifically people of color, people with disabilities, and immigrants. So that is what they are targeting in terms of their base. And economic reality may not actually even really motivate them. Fiscal responsibility may not motivate them. The fact that the economic facts are such that we would actually have more tax revenue probably if people got more money back in wages, if workers got more in wages. The fact that we could fix the fiscal problems with a windfall profits tax. The fact that the economy would be better with more money in the hands of working people, and the fact that these work requirements would do nothing for that, and that their own districts may be harmed, which it's hitting them a little bit. Some of the stuff that got changed in the Limit Save Grow Act was related to renewable energy subsidies that were going to key representatives' districts. But still, with these huge spending cuts, somebody's district, some community, somebody's job is going to be lost. We're talking about 700,000 jobs lost. It's not helping anybody economically. It's not going to... Collapsing the economy and certainly defaulting on the debt is going to hurt a lot of people. And of course, we have the argument, and we know for a fact that there's certainly that there's like a top 0.001%. That's not an actual number. It's just a guesstimate. That's not like a real statistic, but it's a very, very small group of elites. The folks like the Blackstone groups of the world would profit off of an economic collapse because they have enough liquidity and they have enough highly diversified assets that they can just buy up stuff cheaply when the whole economy goes down and then crashes down either because of spending cuts or because of a default. But overall, it's not necessary for economic growth, and it would be very, very painful. And it would have the most dire consequences on vulnerable citizens, especially if you're taking away stuff like medical care from poor people as well as from veterans. But that might not even really matter to them, all of these other points, because they want to attack a certain sort of out-group, and they want to preserve their sort of in-group status. They want to preserve their anti-woke, anti-immigrant, anti-poor people agenda. And on smaller level, on a state level, their policies of preserving their sort of cultural purity, the Republicans are very focused on this cultural purity, even when it is economically not viable. Cultural purity in terms of wanting to have these anti-woke banking laws in states like Texas, which Texas passed a law basically stating that they would not do business with banks who restrict fossil fuel and firearms businesses. And because their state issues and their localities issue municipal bonds that they're done through banks, and they can't do business with certain major banks. I believe it was 5 major banks that they can't do business with. And this was reported in the Wall Street Journal from a Wharton and Fed study. The state of Texas, because of their anti-woke banking laws, their laws that won't allow them to do business with these banks just because these banks decide to care about the fact that climate change could wash out a ton of investments and a ton of money, and that climate change is a very real, very known economic impact, because these banks care about that because they want to protect their profits, and because these banks know that firearms is a risky industry, and they might not want to invest in that when we're seeing people die from gun deaths, and that could be a massive risk and a liability. Just because the state wanted to penalize the banks that didn't fall into line with their particular ideology, they are going to cost their taxpayers $300 to $500 million or more in added interest, because by not using these banks, they have fewer options, and they're not going to get as good of interest rates on the municipal bonds, which is how these governments borrow money for all the functions like roads, schools, things like that. So they are willing to, because of this ideology, cause fiscal irresponsibility. They're creating fiscal irresponsibility. So as much as analysts definitely say, and I definitely believe them, I think that it is true, that we have less of an economic ideologue at the negotiating table in Kevin McCarthy, and the overall Republican Party is less economically driven. It may not mean that we get an overall better outcome necessarily than 2011 or 2013, at least in certain areas. So it may be a different kind of outcome from 2011 or 2013. It may not be as bad of a bill because there are some issues with how sequestration was executed. The Politico article mentioned Henry Cuellar and his issues with how sequestration was issued and managed. But it may be a bad impact in certain other ways. I think that maybe if they get this permitting reform, because that relates to fossil fuels, that might placate them. Obviously not the best thing for the environment, but these projects were going to get approved anyway. It's just the speed at which the projects are approved that this permitting reform would handle. I guess that's a compromise, and that could maybe give them a little bit of that red meat they want. We just have to hope they don't push so hard on these work requirements. Maybe the SNAP ones, maybe part of it will go through. I highly doubt that, especially with groups that are very publicly revered, like the American Lung Association, the American Cancer Society, opposing them, which I really hope that these organizations are making their voices heard, and they do definitely try. Like some of the health-related groups filed amicus briefs in cases regarding Medicaid work requirements when it was tried under the Trump administration. NAMI, the National Alliance on Mental Illness, was big on that one, and March of Dimes was also in on that effort. So hopefully that stuff won't come of being just because of their need to attack the out-group of the people who aren't as strong, tough, hardworking, white American as they want to portray themselves as, these Republicans, in terms of their desire for prejudice. Let's hope that doesn't motivate them too much. And let's see what happens with the staff meeting on Friday. They're probably working out technicalities and different mechanisms and legislative nuances that need to be handled before the parties can come together on more substantive matters. So let's see where this goes. Let's see how this ends up. Of course, fingers crossed, we're not going to see the total and complete destructive calamity of the entire Limit, Save, Grow Act being passed. Are we going to see a default? I certainly hope not. Republicans are continuing to say, well, look, the Democrats are the ones pushing for this because they didn't negotiate over the past 100 days. So politically, it's going to be sort of up in the air. But we'll continue to keep an eye on this, and I will keep you updated. Most likely, the updates will come on the TikTok at FixerPunk, so follow that. Also, the Instagram at FixerPunk as well. If you have any questions, concerns about this, or if you have another issue you want me to cover, if there is something oppressive in your life from government, employers, any of the many institutions that seek to marginalize people in the society that you have a story about, something that you want me to look into, just give me a call. Leave a message anytime, day or night, 844-477-PUNK, 844-477-7865, or you can just email Grayson, Greyson, at offspeedsolutions.com. Thank you so much for joining me, and I hope you have a great rest of your week and that you'll join me again for the next episode.